Sir, please. The voice was a whisper, nearly lost in the downpour. Could you take care of one of my children? Just until I can get back on my feet. Alexander Sterling stopped. The cold, hostile rain of a Manhattan autumn had already soaked through the shoulders of his $5,000 cashmere coat, and his irritation was a physical thing, a coiled knot in his gut. He was late for a meeting that could seal a 9-figure merger, and the last thing he needed was to be accosted by street trash in the middle of Central Park. He turned, his face a mask of bored impatience, ready to dismiss whoever had dared to interrupt his trajectory. But the sight that met him was jarring, a tableau of misery so stark it momentarily silenced the well-oiled machinery of his mind. A woman no older than her late 20s stood shivering under the meager protection of a large oak tree. Her jacket was thin, useless against the deluge, and her hair was plastered to her skull. Clinging to her legs, half hidden in the folds of her worn skirt, were 2 small children, a boy and a girl, twins. They couldn't have been more than 4 years old, their faces pale and pinched with cold, their eyes enormous and dark with a fear that went beyond the storm. It was the woman who had spoken, her own eyes wide with a desperation so profound it was like looking into an abyss. Alexander's momentary shock quickly curdled into disgust. "Are you insane?" The words came out like shards of glass. He took a half-step back as if her poverty might be contagious. Is this some kind of joke? The woman, Isabella, flinched as if he'd struck her. The flicker of hope in her eyes died, replaced by a raw, hollow shame. "No, sir, I swear. My name is Isabella. This is Leo and Mia. We lost everything. The shelter is full. We haven't eaten since yesterday. I don't want your money, I can't watch them starve. I can't let them sleep in this." Her voice broke, a ragged, ugly sound. "My little girl, she's not well, she's coughing. If you could just take one, just for a little while. I'll work. I'll do anything. I'll come back for them. I swear on my life." The sheer, raw audacity of her proposal was an insult to his entire world order. He, Alexander Sterling, a titan of Wall Street who moved markets with a single phone call, being asked to babysit some street urchin? The absurdity was so offensive it made his head spin. "This has to be the oldest, most pathetic trick in the book," he snarled, his voice rising. The little boy, Leo, started to cry, a thin, whimpering sound. The girl, Mia, just stared, her gaze fixed on Alexander with an unnerving intensity, her small body trembling violently. "You think you can just walk up to someone, spin some sob story with a couple of props and expect a handout? You people make me sick. They're not props, they're my children." Isabella's voice rose for the first time, fueled by a maternal fury that briefly overshadowed her fear. "Please, just look at them. My daughter is burning with fever." She pushed the little girl slightly forward. Mia coughed then, a wet, rattling sound that was impossible to ignore. Alexander's gaze flickered to the child. He saw the faint bluish tint to her lips, the unnatural flush on her cheeks. A doctor's son, he recognized the signs of sickness, of real distress. For a single terrifying second, a crack appeared in his armor of contempt. He felt something, an unwelcome, unfamiliar pang, but he crushed it instantly. Weakness was a liability he had surgically removed from his personality decades ago. He saw this not as a human tragedy, but as a calculated attack on his resources, an emotional shakedown. "That's not my problem," he said, his voice dropping back to its default, icy calm. "There are city services for people like you. Go use them. Get a job. Stop using your children as emotional blackmail." He straightened the knot of his silk tie, a nervous, angry gesture. He wanted this to be over. He wanted to erase the sight of them from his memory. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat, his fingers fumbling for his wallet. He wouldn't be a fool, but he would pay to make them go away. It was a transaction, like any other. He pulled out a crumpled $100 bill, pocket change he kept for tips, and with a flick of his wrist, tossed it onto the wet pavement. It landed in a dirty puddle right at her feet. "Here," he spat. "Take this, and get out of my sight. I never want to see your face or theirs again." The act was more violent than a physical blow. The money, a lifeline to her just moments before, was now a brand of her humiliation. Isabella stared at the soggy bill dissolving in the mud. She didn't move to pick it up. She didn't say a word. She simply wrapped her arms tighter around her children, pulling them into her body as if she could absorb them, protect them from the world with her own flesh and bone. She turned her back to him, her thin shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. The rejection was absolute, her dignity the only thing she had left to wield. The sight of her silent, defeated back should have been a victory. It should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. The image of the $100 bill sinking into the grime, of the little girl's rattling cough, of Isabella's shattered expression, it was a stain. He didn't look back. He forced himself not to. But as he stormed away through the driving rain, the image was seared into his brain. Two small, pale faces, their eyes wide with a terror he had put there, watching him disappear into the gray, unforgiving city. 3 months earlier, the world had been different. Not better, just different. Isabella Rossi was not a ghost haunting Central Park. She was a junior accounts manager at a mid-level textile firm called Weaver & Co. She was good at her job. Meticulous, organized, with a quiet competence that made her well-liked by her colleagues. She was a single mother to 2-year-old twins, a reality that structured her entire existence into a tightly wound clockwork of daycare drop-offs, spreadsheets, and bedtime stories. Her life was precarious, a constant balancing act on a wire stretched over a financial abyss, but it was hers. She had a small, clean apartment in Queens, a steady paycheck, and the fierce, unyielding love she felt for Leo and Mia. The wire snapped on a Tuesday. An email, cold and impersonal, announced that Weaver & Co. had been acquired by Sterling Holdings, the corporate behemoth owned by Alexander Sterling. The acquisition was part of a strategic restructuring. The entire New York office was being liquidated. 2 weeks severance. No exceptions. Just like that, the clockwork shattered. For Alexander, the acquisition of Weaver & Comer was a minor footnote in his quarterly report, a small strategic move to absorb a competitor's assets and discard the rest. He didn't know the names or faces of the 300 employees whose lives he had just upended. He didn't care. They were numbers on a balance sheet, redundant assets to be trimmed for maximum efficiency. Isabella, however, was not one to surrender to despair. She was a fighter. She researched Alexander Sterling, learned everything she could about his company, his career, his ruthless efficiency. She saw a path, a desperate, long-shot path, but a path nonetheless. Armed with her flawless performance reviews and a proposal outlining how her skills could be an asset to another Sterling subsidiary, she managed, through sheer unrelenting persistence, to get a 5-minute meeting. Not with him, of course, with his executive assistant. But on the day of the meeting, a stroke of cruel fate intervened. The assistant was called away for an emergency, and as Isabella stood awkwardly in the impossibly lavish reception area of Sterling Tower, Alexander Sterling himself strode out of his office deep in conversation with his fiancée, Victoria Vance. He barely glanced at her, another piece of furniture in his opulent world, but Isabella seized the moment. "Mr. Sterling?" Her voice was steady, professional. He stopped, annoyed by the interruption. Victoria, draped in diamonds and a couture dress, eyed Isabella with unconcealed disdain, her gaze flicking over Isabella's simple, off-the-rack suit. "I'm Isabella Rossi," she said quickly, extending a folder. "I was an accounts manager at Weaver & Co. I know the acquisition resulted in layoffs, but my performance record is exemplary. I believe I can be a valuable asset to your team. I just need a chance." Alexander took the folder, his expression unreadable. He flipped it open. His eyes, the color of cold steel, scanned the first page for no more than 3 seconds. He saw her name, the name of the now-defunct company, and her job title. It was all the information he needed. This was not an ambitious professional seeking an opportunity. This was a loose end, a piece of corporate debris that had somehow washed up at his office door. It was an inconvenience. He closed the folder and handed it back to her. "We're not hiring," he said, the words clipped and final. "But sir, if you just look at my proposal," she began, her voice trembling slightly. It was then that Victoria spoke, her voice a silken, venomous whisper. "Darling, I think what the woman is trying to say is that she wants a handout. It's so tiresome how they always think they're entitled to your time." Alexander looked from Victoria's perfectly sculpted, bored face to Isabella's, which was now pale with shock and humiliation. A faint, cruel smile touched his lips. He saw the situation not as a plea for employment, but as a test of his resolve. Showing weakness, showing any hint of sentimentality, was a fatal flaw in his world. "Victoria is right," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Your employment was a business transaction that is concluded. Sterling Holdings has no further obligation to you. I suggest you take your proposal to the unemployment office. That's what it's for." That was the sin. It wasn't just a refusal. It was the casual, effortless cruelty of it. The way he had dismissed her life's work in 3 seconds. The way he had allowed Victoria to mock her and had smiled in agreement. He held the power to grant her a lifeline with a single lazy wave of his hand. A referral, an interview, a simple word to HR, and he had chosen, with calculated indifference, to watch her drown. The elevator doors slid shut on his impassive face, leaving Isabella standing alone in the cavernous, silent lobby, the folder clutched in her hand like a useless shield. That single act of callousness was a stone dropped into a still pond. The ripples spread outward, devastatingly. The 2-week severance evaporated in a flash of rent and unpaid bills. Her desperate job search yielded nothing in a saturated market. Savings dwindled, then vanished. The eviction notice came next. Then the terrifying nights in overcrowded city shelters. The constant fear, the gnawing hunger. The descent was brutally swift. And it all led here, to this moment in the park, drenched in a cold autumn rain, her daughter sick and shivering, begging the very man who had dropped the stone to save her from the waves. The rain did nothing to wash away the memory. If anything, it seemed to seal it behind Alexander's eyes. Back in the sterile, climate-controlled silence of his Bentley, the image of the woman and her children replayed itself with infuriating persistence. The little girl's cough, the way the $100 bill had looked like a dead leaf in the muddy water. He shook his head, gripping the leather-wrapped steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. It was a scam, a well-rehearsed, pathetic scam. He had done the right thing, the only thing. Any sign of weakness, and he would have had a line of them outside his office by morning. He repeated the words to himself like a mantra, a shield against the unfamiliar prickle of something. Guilt? No, that was a useless emotion. It was annoyance. That's all it was. When he arrived at his penthouse, Victoria was waiting, a vision of curated perfection in a silk robe, a glass of champagne in her hand. "You're late, darling," she said, her voice a low purr. "And you look like you wrestled a storm cloud." He grunted, shrugging out of his damp coat and handing it to the silent housekeeper. He poured himself a whiskey, the amber liquid a welcome fire in his throat. "You wouldn't believe the nerve of some people," he muttered, more to himself than to her. He told her then a clipped, dismissive version of the events in the park. He painted Isabella as a calculating grifter, the children as props in her cheap drama. He expected validation, a shared laugh at the woman's audacity. Victoria listened, her expression carefully neutral, but behind her eyes, a cold calculation was taking place. She didn't see a pathetic beggar. She saw a liability, a loose thread that could unravel the perfect tapestry of their lives. Their wedding was the social event of the season. The Sterling-Vance merger was on the verge of creating a corporate empire. A scandal, a homeless woman, sick children, a heartless billionaire, was the last thing she needed. The press would have a field day. "How dreadful for you," she said, placing a cool hand on his arm. "You were right to send her away, of course. You can't let people like that get to you." But her mind was already racing. Alexander was powerful, but he was also arrogant. He thought dismissing the woman was the end of it. Victoria knew better. Desperate people did desperate things. The next morning, while Alexander was in a board meeting erasing companies from existence with the stroke of a pen, Victoria made a call. The recipient was a man named Peterson, a former private investigator who now specialized in reputation management. His methods were discreet, effective, and thoroughly unethical. "There's a woman," Victoria said, her voice as crisp as a new banknote. "She has 2 children. She approached my fiancé, Alexander Sterling, in Central Park yesterday. I want you to find her. I want you to make sure she understands that bothering Mr. Sterling again would be unwise. I want her to disappear, quietly." Peterson, a man who thrived on the quiet desperation of the wealthy, understood perfectly. "Consider it handled, Ms. Vance," he said. For Isabella, the world had shrunk to the size of a cot in a noisy, foul-smelling homeless shelter in the Bronx. She had found the place after 2 more nights on the street, a last resort against the relentless rain. Mia's fever was worse, a dry, consuming heat that left her listless and weak. The antibiotics from the clinic were doing nothing. Isabella spent every waking moment holding her, whispering stories, trying to coax her to drink water. Leo, sensing the terror in his mother's heart, was quiet and withdrawn, his thumb permanently lodged in his mouth. The first blow from Peterson landed 3 days later. A man in a cheap suit delivered an envelope to her at the shelter. It was a formal-looking letter on what appeared to be city letterhead, informing her that a complaint had been filed. It stated that she was an unfit mother and that her presence was a health and safety risk to the other residents. She was to vacate the premises within 48 hours. Panic, cold, and absolute seized her. The shelter manager, a harried, overworked woman, just shrugged. "The city sends these out," she said, not meeting Isabella's eyes. "My hands are tied." The next day, the second blow. An anonymous call was placed to Child Protective Services. Isabella was in the middle of trying to sponge Mia's forehead with a cool cloth when 2 caseworkers arrived. They were professional but firm, their questions like a barrage of small, sharp stones. Where was the children's father? Why weren't they in stable housing? Was she aware of how sick her daughter was? They looked at the cramped cot, at the meager bag of belongings, at Mia's flushed, feverish face, and their expressions tightened. They told her they were opening an official investigation into neglect. They used words like foster care and temporary removal. Isabella felt the floor drop out from under her. This wasn't bad luck anymore. This was a targeted attack. It was him. It had to be him, the man in the park. He hadn't been content to just humiliate her. Now he was trying to destroy her, to take away the only thing in the world that mattered. The injustice was a physical weight, crushing the air from her lungs. While Alexander Sterling sat in his sky-high office, insulated from the world by his fortune, his name was being used as a weapon to tear her family apart. That night, as Mia's breathing became a shallow, ragged gasp, Isabella held her children in the darkness of the shelter. No longer just a victim of circumstance, but the target of a cruelty so profound she could barely comprehend it. She was no longer just fighting to survive. She was fighting an enemy she couldn't see, an enemy with limitless power and a heart of stone. Weeks passed. Alexander immersed himself in the savage rhythm of his work, a world of hostile takeovers and brutal negotiations where his brand of cold-blooded logic was not a flaw, but a celebrated asset. He closed the Sterling Vance merger, a move that made headlines in the Wall Street Journal and solidified his place at the apex of the city's financial food chain. He and Victoria were the new power couple, their faces gracing the covers of society magazines. Their engagement party a lavish affair that dripped with champagne and casual contempt for the world outside their gilded cage. He was winning. By every metric he had ever valued, wealth, power, influence, he was at the absolute pinnacle of his life. And yet, something was wrong. The memory of the park should have faded, a trivial anecdote of urban unpleasantness. Instead, it had become a splinter in his mind, sharp and persistent. In the dead of night he would wake up, the echo of a child's rattling cough in his ears. During a high-stakes negotiation, he would see a pair of wide, terrified eyes staring back at him from across the polished mahogany table. He told himself it was stress. He told himself it was a fleeting moment of weakness. He doubled down on his cynicism, his public pronouncements on the laziness of the poor becoming even more vitriolic, a desperate attempt to shout down the whisper of doubt in his own soul. He never mentioned the woman to Victoria again, and she never asked. The incident was buried, a secret shame he refused to acknowledge even to himself. The crack in his armor came from the most unexpected of sources. Frank, his driver for over 15 years, was a man of few words. He was a part of the Bentley, as silent and reliable as the engine. He had ferried Alexander to and from countless deals, had overheard secrets that could topple companies, and had never once offered an unsolicited opinion. Until a rainy Tuesday afternoon, almost a month after the incident in the park, Alexander was in the back, snapping orders into his phone, his voice a whip crack of impatience. After he hung up, the silence in the car felt heavy, broken only by the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers. "Mr. Sterling?" Frank's voice from the front seat was quiet, hesitant. "What is it, Frank?" Alexander answered, not looking up from his tablet. "Sorry to bother you, sir. It's not my place." Frank paused, his eyes meeting Alexander's in the rearview mirror for a brief second. "It's just that woman in the park, the one with the kids." Alexander's head snapped up, his eyes narrowed. "What about her?" "I saw the whole thing, sir. From the car," Frank continued, his voice steady. "I saw you offer her some money, and I saw her walk away. She never picked it up, sir. It was still lying in the puddle when we drove off." The statement was simple, factual, devoid of judgment. And for that reason, it struck Alexander with the force of a physical blow. He had constructed an entire narrative around the encounter, a narrative in which he was the savvy victim of a clumsy shakedown. He had told himself, and Victoria, that the woman was a common grifter whose only goal was his money. But Frank's words presented a fact that didn't fit. A con artist, a beggar, a desperate woman whose only goal was cash. She would have taken the money. $100 was $100, soggy or not. Pride was a luxury people in her position couldn't afford. So why had she left it there? Your point? Alexander asked, his voice dangerously low. No point, sir, Frank said quickly, his gaze returning to the road. Just an observation. Apologies for speaking out of turn. The rest of the drive passed in a thick, humming silence. When they pulled up to Sterling Tower, Alexander got out of the car without another word. But he didn't go inside. He stood on the pavement as the Bentley pulled away, the words echoing in his mind. She never picked it up, sir. It was a small thing, a tiny detail, but it was a crack in the foundation of his certainty. It suggested a different story, a story about a woman whose desperation was real, whose pride was stronger than her hunger, a woman who hadn't wanted his money, but his help. He had spent weeks building a fortress of justifications around his actions that day, and a quiet, 5-second observation from his driver had just placed a stick of dynamite at its base. He still resisted. He still told himself Frank had misjudged the situation, that the woman was just a clever actress, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and as he finally walked into his tower of glass and steel, he felt for the first time that the walls were not there to protect him, but to blind him. Doubt is a foreign country, and Alexander Sterling was now an unwilling immigrant. He had spent his life in the stark, black and white territory of facts and figures, of profit and loss. But Frank's simple observation had marooned him in a gray, murky landscape of uncertainty, and he found he could not navigate it. She never picked it up, sir. The phrase became a virus in his operating system, corrupting his logic. He tried to bury it under mountains of work, but the image of the soggy $100 bill was always there, a quiet, damning piece of evidence. The annoyance he had felt curdled into a low, thrumming anxiety. He needed data. He needed to know the end of the story. Not for her sake, he told himself, but for his own. He needed to prove to himself that she was a con artist who had simply moved on to her next mark. He needed to restore his world to its proper order. He couldn't use his own security team. They were too close, and any inquiry would get back to Victoria. He needed an outsider, a ghost. He made a call to a number he hadn't used in years, a contact from a past life when he was clawing his way up the corporate ladder and information was a weapon. The man's name was Sullivan, a private investigator who was less a man and more a shadow, known for his absolute discretion and his unnerving ability to find needles in entire cities of haystacks. I need you to find someone, Alexander said, his voice low and clipped, standing in the soundproofed sanctuary of his home office. A woman, late 20s, 2 kids, twins, a boy and a girl, around 4 years old. She was in Central Park on the afternoon of October 12th. Find her. I want to know everything. Where she is, what her situation is. I want to know if she's filed any complaints, talked to any lawyers, or gone to the press. This is a potential nuisance abatement, nothing more. Be discreet. I don't want her to know she's being watched. Just get me the facts. Sullivan was a professional. He took the meager details and began to weave them into a coherent thread. He started with the park's security footage, cross-referencing the time and location Alexander had given him. He found her, a grainy, high-angle shot of a woman in a thin jacket, huddled under a tree with 2 small children. He used facial recognition software, running her image against a dozen databases. He got a hit. Isabella Rossi, 29, last known address in Queens, a recently terminated employee of Weaver & Co. The first report landed on Alexander's encrypted server 2 days later. It was a single page, a collection of cold, hard facts. Subject: Isabella Rossi. Dependents: Leo and Mia Rossi, twins. Age 4. Employment status: terminated. Company: Weaver & Comer, a subsidiary of Sterling Holdings. Residence: evicted from Queens apartment, currently residing at the St. Jude's Family Shelter in the Bronx. Alexander stared at the words, Sterling Holdings. The connection was a punch to the gut. This wasn't some random grifter. This was one of his own former employees, a woman his company had laid off. He remembered the woman in his lobby now, the one with the folder, the one Victoria had mocked. The sin was not random, it was personal. He had fired her, then he had brutalized her. The feeling in his stomach was no longer anxiety. It was the cold, heavy dread of responsibility. He immediately messaged Sullivan, "Keep digging. I want to know everything about her situation at that shelter. Everything." The second report came 48 hours later, and it was the one that shattered everything. Sullivan, thorough as always, had not just looked at public records. He had sources. A contact inside the city's social services network. The report detailed the official complaint filed against Isabella at the shelter, citing unfit mother and health risk. It included the anonymous tip to Child Protective Services, and it detailed the current status of Mia Rossi, admitted to the pediatric ward of Bronx Community Hospital 2 days prior. Diagnosis: severe pneumonia, complicated by malnutrition. The doctors had been forced to put her into a medically induced coma to stabilize her breathing. Alexander read the report 3 times, the words blurring into a meaningless jumble before snapping back into sharp, horrific focus. A little girl was in a coma because she had been sick, and he had left her in the rain. A mother was on the verge of losing her children because of complaints that had materialized out of thin air, just days after she had spoken to him. It was too much to be a coincidence. This wasn't just a tragic series of unfortunate events. This was a targeted, systematic attack. Someone was trying to erase Isabella Rossi. He sat in his penthouse, a palace built on a foundation of ruthless certainty, and felt the entire structure begin to crumble. His actions had not been a simple, isolated act of cruelty. They had been the first push of a domino that had led to this. The question was no longer what had happened to the woman in the park. The question, the one that now screamed in the silence of his office, was who had pushed the rest of the dominoes. He pulled up the grainy security photo Sullivan had sent him, a picture of Isabella holding her 2 children. He looked at their small, trusting faces, and for the first time in his adult life, Alexander Sterling felt a terrifying, unfamiliar emotion: fear. The question was no longer what happened. It was who. Alexander Sterling's world, once a universe governed by logic and control, had become a dark room full of monsters. The little girl's illness, the social services investigation, the eviction notice from the shelter, they weren't accidents. They were acts of war. Someone was trying to erase Isabella and her children from existence, and the attack had begun just after he'd encountered her. The coincidence was so glaring it was an insult to his intelligence. He picked up his encrypted phone. The call to Sullivan was short, Alexander's voice a thread of ice-cold steel. "Forget the woman," he commanded. "I want to know who's behind this. Who called Child Protective Services? Who fabricated the complaint at the shelter? I want the name, the motive, and the proof. Investigate everyone. My staff, Victoria's staff, the devil himself if you have to. Find the hand that pushed the pieces." Sullivan was more than an investigator. He was a digital surgeon. With the new objective in hand, he began to dissect the anatomy of the attack. The anonymous call to social services was the first thread. He traced it to a burner phone, bought with cash at a convenience store in Queens. No name, a dead end, but the store had security cameras. Sullivan pulled the footage. It showed a man in a cheap suit and a forgettable face buying the phone. A ghost. Next, the complaint at the shelter. It had been sent via email, from a generic address. Another dead end. But every email carries a fingerprint and IP address. The IP address originated from a public computer at the New York Public Library. Untraceable. For an amateur, the trail would have ended there. But Sullivan was no amateur. He hacked the library's records. He found the access log for the exact computer at the exact minute the email was sent. The user had been logged into the guest Wi-Fi network of a law firm across the street, a firm called Peterson & Associates, a practice known in the shadier circles for specializing in problem-solving for the rich and unscrupulous. The name Peterson set off an alarm in Sullivan's mind. It was the same name as the man whose forgettable face appeared on the convenience store footage. Now he had a name, a face, and a target. The final firewall was the money. Villains like Peterson didn't work for free. Sullivan dove into the lawyer's finances. He found what he was looking for, a large, undeclared cash deposit made 2 days after Victoria had spoken to Alexander about the nuisance in the park. The cash was untraceable, of course, but Peterson was a man of habit. He had been the personal fixer for one very specific client for years. Sullivan broke into the law firm's servers, a digital fortress he dismantled in a matter of hours. And there it was, the smoking gun, invoices, emails, call transcripts, all documenting years of dirty work. and the client's name on every document was the same: Victoria Vance. The final report landed on Alexander's secure server at 2 in the morning. It was no longer a summary of facts, it was a full autopsy of a conspiracy. He opened the file. There was the photo of Peterson buying the burner phone. There was a copy of the fraudulent email sent to the shelter. There were the bank records showing the payment, wired from a shell corporation that Sullivan, with one final devastating click, had traced back to a parent company, Vance Industries. The revelation wasn't an earthquake. It was the end of the world. Every piece clicked into place with a sickening clarity. The hand pushing the pieces wasn't a stranger's. It was the hand that wore the diamond engagement ring he had given her. Victoria, his fiancée, the woman he was going to merge his empire and his life with. It hadn't been to protect him from a scandal. It had been an act of pure, sadistic convenience. Isabella and her children were an imperfection in the perfect design of her life, and Victoria had simply decided to erase them, with all the emotion of someone sending a stained dress to the dry cleaners. He looked at Victoria's profile picture in the file, smiling at a charity event, and for the first time he saw not beauty or ambition, but an absolute void, a darkness. He remembered her disdain in the lobby. It's so tiresome how they always think they're entitled to your time. It wasn't arrogance, it was the philosophy of a predator. And he, Alexander Sterling, the master of the universe, had been the blindest fool of all. He had been her accomplice. His cruelty in the park hadn't been the start of the story. It had been the permission she needed to start her own. He opened the last picture in the file. It was a photo of Mia Rossi, taken by Sullivan's contact at the hospital. She was small and pale in an oversized bed, a breathing tube taped to her tiny face. That tube was there because of him. That suffering was his work. The plush silence of his penthouse was deafening. The city glittered outside, indifferent. But inside him, the calm was over. A storm of cold, crystalline fury was gathering. The world he had built was a lie, and he was about to burn it to the ground. The fury that had crystallized in Alexander's penthouse did not erupt in a fiery rage. It settled into something far more dangerous, a block of ice-cold, methodical purpose. He spent the next 24 hours, not in anger, but in action. He met with his legal team, a grim council of war. He restructured his assets, disentangling his empire from anything connected to Vance Industries. He moved with the brutal efficiency of a corporate raider. Only this time, his target was his own life. The battle would take place at the annual museum gala, the glittering apex of New York's social calendar. It was Victoria's masterpiece, an event she had chaired and orchestrated for months. It was to be their coronation as the city's undisputed power couple. For Alexander, it was the perfect stage for an execution. He arrived looking impeccable in a custom tuxedo, a mask of calm civility firmly in place. Victoria, radiant in a gown of blood-red silk and dripping with diamonds, greeted him with a kiss. "Darling, you're finally here," she purred, oblivious to the abyss that had opened between them. "Isn't it perfect?" He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw only the chilling emptiness behind her smile. "Perfect," he agreed, his voice a dead, flat calm. He played the part for 2 hours, mingling with billionaires and politicians, a ghost at his own feast. He watched Victoria bask in the adoration of their peers, a queen reigning over a kingdom of lies. Then came the time for his speech. As the primary benefactor, he was expected to say a few words. Victoria squeezed his hand as he walked to the stage, whispering, "Make us proud." He stepped up to the podium. The faces of the city's elite turned up towards him, expectant. A massive screen behind him displayed the gala's elegant logo. "Good evening," he began, his voice amplified throughout the cavernous hall. "Thank you all for coming. We're here tonight to raise money for the museum's new arts education wing, a noble cause." He paused, letting the silence hang. "But I won't be talking about that tonight." A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. "Instead, I want to tell you a story about a woman named Isabella Rossi." He saw Victoria's smile falter. "About a month ago, I met her in Central Park. She was unemployed, laid off by a company I had just acquired. She was homeless. She had 2 4-year-old children, twins. Her daughter was sick. She asked me for help, and I, in my arrogance, threw a $100 bill at her feet and told her to get out of my sight. A collective gasp went through the room. This was not the speech they were expecting. "That was my sin," Alexander continued, his voice raw, unsparing. "But my sin was just the beginning. What happened next was an act of calculated sociopathic cruelty, perpetrated by someone in this room. He clicked a button in his hand. The Gala logo on the screen behind him vanished, replaced by the grainy security footage of Peterson buying the burner phone. This man was hired to terrorize Isabella, to have her evicted from a shelter, to file a false neglect complaint with Child Protective Services. Click. A copy of the fraudulent email appeared. Click. A bank statement showing a wire transfer from Avance Industries Shell Corporation. The goal was to make a problem disappear, and the person who hired him was my fiancée, Victoria Vance. The room erupted. Victoria's face was a mask of horror, her skin as white as the tablecloths. She started to stand to protest, but the evidence was right there, projected 10 feet high for the entire world to see. The merger between Sterling Holdings and Vance Industries is terminated, effective immediately, Alexander announced, his voice like the tolling of a bell. As is our engagement. A full dossier of this evidence has been delivered to the district attorney's office. They can expect my full cooperation. He had not just ruined her socially, he had condemned her. Then came the final, brutal act of atonement. Every dollar raised tonight, along with $50 million of my personal fortune, will be redirected. Effective immediately, I am establishing a new foundation. It will be dedicated to providing housing, legal aid, and medical care to homeless families in this city. It will be called the Mia and Leo Rossi Foundation. He left the stage without another word, walking through the stunned, silent crowd that parted before him like the Red Sea. He didn't look at Victoria. He didn't need to. He left her there, broken amidst the ruins of the world she had tried so hard to build. His car was waiting, but he didn't go back to his penthouse. Bronx Community Hospital, he told Frank. An hour later, he was standing outside the pediatric intensive care unit. He found Isabella sitting by her daughter's bedside, her face etched with exhaustion and fear. She looked up and saw him, and her body went rigid with terror. He stopped at the doorway, stripped of his power, his suit, his name. He was just a man who had caused immeasurable pain. Isabella, he said, his voice quiet, hoarse. I know what Victoria did. All of it. I ended it. She will face justice for what she's done. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He had no right. Instead, he made a promise, the only thing he had left to offer. I am going to fix this. I will bring the best doctors in the world to care for Mia. I have secured a place for you to live, a safe place. You will never have to be afraid again. This is my fault, and I will spend the rest of my life making it right. The downfall of Victoria Vance was as swift as it was brutal. The evidence Alexander provided was irrefutable. The district attorney, smelling a high-profile case that would make his career, pressed charges for harassment, conspiracy, and reckless endangerment. Stripped of Alexander's financial and social protection, Victoria's world collapsed. Her so-called friends abandoned her, her business partners severed all ties, and the society pages that had once adored her now chronicled her every humiliating court appearance. She was convicted and sentenced not to a country club prison, but to a state facility, her couture gowns replaced by a drab orange jumpsuit. Her ruin was absolute, a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties for years to come. Alexander, however, found no satisfaction in her demise. His focus was singular, an obsession with atonement. He flew in a team of the world's leading pediatric pulmonologists. He spared no expense, leveraging every resource at his command, not with the arrogance of a billionaire, but with the quiet desperation of a repentant father. He was there at the hospital every day, not in the waiting room, but in a chair beside Isabella's, keeping a silent, respectful vigil. He learned the nurses' names. He learned to read the beeps and hums of the machines that were keeping Mia alive. He never offered empty platitudes or easy apologies. Instead, he offered his presence. He listened when Isabella, in her exhaustion, spoke of her children, of their favorite foods, of the silly songs they liked. He brought Leo toys and books, and would sit on the floor of the hospital playroom with him for hours, patiently building towers of blocks that Leo would inevitably knock down with a shriek of laughter. Slowly, painstakingly, Mia began to heal. When she was finally stable enough to leave the hospital, Alexander didn't send them to a faceless apartment. He had purchased a modest, comfortable brownstone in a quiet, family-friendly neighborhood, fully furnished with a small backyard. He handed Isabella the keys and a deed, not a lease. "This is yours," he said simply. "It's not a gift. It's a restitution for everything you lost because of me." He established a trust for the children that would guarantee their education and their future. But more than that, he gave them his time. He was there for every follow-up doctor's appointment. He learned to make pancakes, Leo's favorite, on Saturday mornings. He discovered he was surprisingly good at untangling the knots in Mia's fine hair. He was not buying their affection. He was earning their trust, one small, consistent act at a time. 1 year later, the sound of children's laughter echoed through the warm, sunlit kitchen of the brownstone. Leo and Mia, now 5 years old and brimming with health and energy, were chasing each other around a large wooden table. Alexander, minus his suit jacket, his sleeves rolled up, was at the stove, flipping pancakes. Isabella sat at the table, a textbook open in front of her, a soft smile on her face. With the foundation's support, she had enrolled in university, pursuing a degree in social work. Her program, which she now helped run, had become one of the most effective in the city for helping single mothers get back on their feet. "Dad, they're burning!" Mia shrieked with delight. Alexander turned, feigning alarm. "They're not burning, they're caramelized," he declared, scooping the pancakes onto a plate and bringing them to the table. He sat down and Leo immediately climbed into his lap. Isabella looked at him, her eyes filled with a gentle, hard-won affection. The relationship they had built was not one of fairy tale romance, but something quieter, deeper, and more real. It was a partnership built on mutual respect and a shared love for the two small people who were the center of their universe. The wealth that surrounded them was incidental, a tool that had facilitated their healing but was not the source of their happiness. Their true wealth was in this kitchen, in the easy rhythm of a Saturday morning, in the shared smiles and the sticky maple syrup fingerprints on the table. Alexander Sterling's redemption had not erased his past, but it had transformed him. The arrogant billionaire who had once seen people as numbers on a balance sheet had learned that the only true measure of a man's worth is the love he gives and the family he chooses to build.